I led at an early pier life by commercial views to the country northwest of Lake Superior in North America. And being endowed by nature with an inquisitive mind and enterprising spirit, I not only contemplated penetrating across the continent, but was confident in my qualifications to undertake the perilous enterprise.
In June of the year 1789, a flotilla of canoes came down Great Slave Lake, led by Alexander Mackenzie, a fur trader for the Northwest Company. The winter before, at Fort Chippewan, he had stared at a rough map drawn by an adventurer named Peter Pond, which showed a great river running west from here. Pond thought that it led to the Pacific, and now Mackenzie was determined. He was not a highly skilled navigator, but rather an ambitious young businessman who hoped to find new sources of fur and establish his own fame and fortune in so doing. His journal of that summer's adventures makes it clear that in his mind he achieved only partial success, but history would later credit him with reaching the Arctic Ocean, one of the great journeys of all time.
My crew consisted of 4 Canadians: Barrière, Delorme, Doucette, and Landry, 2 of whom were attended by their wives, together with a German, John Steinbruck. We were accompanied also by an Indian chief, a principal leader of his countrymen who had been in the habit of carrying furs to Churchill Factory on Hudson's Bay. Together with his wives, who traveled with him in a small canoe, this man and 2 other young Indians were engaged to serve us as interpreters and hunters. On the 3rd of June, as soon as the ice permitted, we descended the river from Lake Athabasca to Great Slave Lake, whence we attempted for several toilsome days to find the outlet. Finally, at 5:30 on the morning of June the 29th, we reached the extremity of a point which we doubled and found it to be the branch or passage which was the object of our search. The current now strengthened, but the wind became so variable as to be almost useless. During the whole of this day's voyage, there were great quantities of ice along the banks of the river. At 9 the next morning, we perceived a very high mountain ahead, which appeared on our nearer approach to be rather a cluster of mountains stretching as far as our view could reach. The river at this point began to veer northward, and we could only hope that it would pass around the mountains in that direction, for we could see no sign of a valley among the peaks ahead. The current remained strong, and we proceeded with great caution, as we continually expected to approach some great rapid. Persuaded that we heard those sounds which betokened a fall of water. We were deceived, however, as none appeared. About 6 o'clock this day, a violent storm accompanied by rain forced us to camp, not, however, before we had suffered the inconvenience of being drenched by it. According to my reckoning, since my last observation, we had run 217 miles west and 44 miles to the north. I am mistrustful now of Mr. Peter Pond's account that this river runs into the Pacific Ocean, for we are already westward of the ocean itself by his sketching of the distance, and not even a sign as yet of a passage through these rocky mountains. The Canadians are always cheerful. But the Indians complain today of the perseverance with which we push forward. The sun rose at 7 minutes before 2 next morning by my watch, and we embarked soon after, steering north-northwest through islands for 5 miles and west 4 miles. The river then increased in breadth, and the current began to slacken in a small degree. We continued to perceive high mountains before us covered with snow, and at 7:15 o'clock we saw several smokes on the north shore, which we made every exertion to approach. As we drew nearer, we discovered the natives running about in great apparent confusion. When they perceived that it was impossible to avoid us as we were already landed, they made us signs to keep at a distance, with which we complied. Our hunters addressed the few who had not escaped in the Chippewayan tongue, which at first they pretended they did not understand. But soon it appeared that some of them at least perfectly comprehended the language of our Indians, and when they had recovered from their alarm of hostile intention, they were at length persuaded, though not without evident signs of reluctance and apprehension, to call their fugitive companions from their hiding places. There were 5 families, consisting of 25 or 30 persons, and of 2 different tribes, the Slave and Dog Rib Indians. We not only unloaded our canoe, but set up camp and pitched our tents before we made any attempt whatsoever to approach them. When they were at length reconciled to our arrival, we began to attempt conversations with them, for indeed we had great need of whatever information they might be able to offer us with regard to this region. We made them smoke, though it was evident they did not know the use of tobacco. We likewise supplied them with grog, but I am disposed to think that they accepted our civilities rather from fear than from inclination. We acquired a much more effectual influence over them by the distribution of knives, awls, rings, and hatchets. The information which they gave respecting the river had so much of the fabulous that I shall not detail it. They attempted to persuade us that it would require several winters to get to the sea, and that old age would come upon us before the period of our return. We were also to encounter monsters of such horrid shapes and destructive powers as could only exist in their wild imaginations. Though I placed no faith in these strange relations, they had a very different effect upon our Indians, who were already tired of the voyage. It was their anxious wish that we should not hesitate to return, and it was with no small trouble that they were persuaded to disregard these stories. By my desire, they induced one of those Indians to accompany us, in consideration of a small kettle, an axe, a knife, and some other articles. During the next 10 days, this worthy and a long train of his successors, whom he engaged at various encampments down the river, never ceased to prophesy disaster. They all abounded in discouraging stories concerning the dangers and difficulties which we were to encounter. The rabbit-skin Indians, in particular, told us of the ferocious Eskimo to the north, and of the fantastic monsters with which the regions below were infested. Our guides invariably attempted to escape after accompanying us for short distances, and it became necessary to keep a strict watch over them during the night. On Saturday, July the 11th, I sat up all night to observe the sun, and when at 12:30 it began to rise again, I called up one of the men to view a spectacle which he had never seen before. On seeing the sun so high, he thought it was a signal to embark, and would scarcely be persuaded by me that it was now but a short time past midnight, and that he had no need to call up the rest of his companions. At noon this same day, I obtained an observation that gave me 68 degrees 47 minutes north latitude, which was further north than I expected, according to the course I had kept. But the difference was owing to the variation in the compass, which was more easterly than I imagined. The necessity of stopping to record our position had at first fascinated our companions, but I fear that by this time it had become for them merely one of our many inexplicable practices. I used as artificial horizon a small pan of quicksilver, which cost me enormous trouble to transport this distance, but which I dare not give to anyone else to carry, it being so peculiar a substance. It was evident to me by now that the waters on which we were embarked emptied themselves into the Hyperborean or frozen sea rather than into the Pacific. And though it was probable that from want of provision we could not return to Athabasca in the course of the season, I nevertheless determined to penetrate to the discharge of them. Our most recent guide had manifested apprehensions that the Eskimo might kill us and take away the women, and our hunters became so disheartened from these accounts that I am confident they would have left me if it had been in their power. But I had been at pains to supply them with only such powder and shot as would suffice for a few days' hunting. I, however, satisfied them in some degree by the assurance that I would proceed onward but a few days more, and if I did not then get to the sea, I would turn back. As we proceeded through this vast country with infinite labor and discomfort, I was unable to obtain any more reliable account than we already had of the passage which I sought through these mountains. Of what lay to the westward, such informants as we could find either knew nothing or else had heard only fantastic stories. Many of them did speak of a great white man's lake, but none was aware of a river which led there, or so my Indians invariably informed me. On the 13th of August, about 9 in the morning, I perceived a smoke on the shore to the southwest at the distance of 3 leagues. The Indians, who were a little way ahead of us, did not discover it, being engaged in the pursuit of a flock of ducks, at which they fired several shots. The smokes then immediately disappeared. There were some deserted canoes visible high up on the shore, and we made strenuous efforts to approach across the current. Our hunters, observing our intentions, quickly outdistanced us, being much lighter, and landed at about 10:30, where a campsite had been but freshly abandoned by the footsteps on the beach and the many articles left lying about. Instead of seeking the natives, however, my Indians began dividing their property, which very much displeased me. I rebuked the chief with some severity for his conduct, and immediately ordered his young men to go in search of the fugitives. The chief was very much displeased at my reproaches, and expressed himself to me in person to that effect, having first recalled his followers. I stated to him that I had come a great way and at very considerable expense without having completed the object of my wishes, and that I suspected he had concealed from me a principal part of what the natives had told him respecting the country, lest he be obliged to follow me. He was content, he said, to be the lord of his own forests, but I seemed as if I wished to be the lord of all the north. He declared that he would not accompany me any further, that though he was without ammunition, he could live in the same manner as the inhabitants of that part of the country, and that he would remain among them. I did not interrupt their grief for many hours, but as I could not well do without them, I was at length obliged to soothe it and induce the chief to change his resolution. A dram or two finally dispelled his heartburning and discontent, and he declared his intention to continue with us, but only until our return to the great Slave Lake, when he would leave us and prepare to stay some time among the Beaver Indians who lived to the south of that territory. Two days later, we came to what appeared to be the shores of a large lake. Though the wind was very strong on shore, at a distance leagues out, the lake appeared to be covered with ice, and no land ahead save islands. We encamped amid these islands for several days, in hopes that the wind would change, and on one of my walks I came across a house, or rather hut, belonging to the natives, which appeared to have been inhabited during the past winter. The ground plot is of an oval form, the whole of it dug about 12 inches below the surface of the ground. In and about the house I found all manner of bones, and though I could not determine the animal to which they largely belonged, I conjectured that it must be the seahorse. There were various utensils and weapons cunningly fashioned of bone also. The hut itself was about 15 feet long and 10 feet wide, made of driftwood covered with branches and dry grass, over which was laid a foot deep of turf. There was a hearth on one side of the interior, and a hole in the roof for a chimney, and I fancy that in the winter time it must have been a warm, if rather a smoky, habitation. For most of the time we spent among these islands, the wind blew hard from the northwest, so that it was exceedingly perilous to venture from shore in our frail canoes. Being awakened by some casual circumstance at 4 o'clock one morning, I was surprised on perceiving that the water had flowed ungage, and indeed that our large canoe was fast deserting us. The Canadians, most of whom could not swim, nevertheless were quick to aid me, for indeed we were in peril of disaster. The beach fortunately continued to shelve in a gradual manner underneath the water, so that all we sustained was a wetting, which was severe enough, the water being so cold that no one could have supported himself in it for long without paralysis of the limbs. As the wind had not changed, we were all of the opinion that this accident proceeded from the tide. The water continued to rise till about 6, and the wind then started to freshen. About 8, one of my men saw a great many animals in the water, which he at first had supposed to be pieces of ice. On being asked to resolve the doubts which had taken place respecting this extraordinary appearance, I perceived that they were white whales, although barely distinguishable from the waves at such a distance. I reasoned from this that the water some few miles off must be salt, as these are creatures of the sea. Next morning I ordered a post to be erected, on which I engraved the latitude and an account of our sojourn there. The Canadians and I were anxious to proceed further, but our canoes were too frail, and mindful of my promise to the chief, I gave orders with bitter disappointment that we should make for the river and stem the current. At 10 in the morning on the 21st, we left the channels formed by the islands for the uninterrupted channel of the river, where we found the current so strong that it was absolutely necessary to tow the canoes with a line. During the greater part of the day I walked with the chief, and we found it very disagreeable, although it helped lighten our respective canoes. This painful progress lasted more or less continually for several weeks, until at last, on Saturday the 22nd of August, we reached once more the entrance of Great Slave Lake and encountered a steady wind astern, which encouraged us to raise our sail. It was now 81 days since we had left Fort Chipewyan on Lake Athabasca, and we had accomplished a voyage of some 2,500 miles by my reckoning, with another 600 remaining ahead. Though these events, those who love to be astonished, or are enamored of romantic adventures, nevertheless, when it is considered that I explored those waters which had never before borne any other vessel than the canoe of the aborigine, and traversed those deserts where a European had never before presented himself to the eye of its swarthy natives, this work will, I flatter myself, be found to excite interest and conciliate regard in the minds of those who peruse it. Though I had not reached my goal, nevertheless I had uncovered a passage to a different ocean, and the map with which I had started out bore little resemblance to the one with which I now returned. I counted it my firmest purpose from this day on to improve my knowledge of surveying and navigation, which was sadly inadequate, and to return to seek a passage through those western mountains.